Hello and welcome back to History of the Netherlands. The last 4 episodes have been a divergence from the main chronology so that we could tackle a few standalone topics which weren't specifically about princes, princesses, and their political machinations to found long-lasting dynasties. Rather, we wanted to look at some major trends and forces that were occurring around the second half of the 15th century, which we feel are super important to setting the context for the Netherlands' future developments and prosperity. If you think about making this podcast as building a dam in the river, we don't want to only tell the stories of the fancy people who financed it and who made decisions about which bricks to use or who gained the rights to charge tolls and control the locks. We also want to know about things like how are dams built and what kind of stuff are they made of. With this in mind, we explored the emergence of humanism, book printing and publication, water management, and shipbuilding in the previous episodes because we saw them as some of the most important bricks and mortar that make up the history of the Netherlands. By the way, bricks are also one of the bricks in our metaphorical dam of Dutch history. Have no fear, one day we will do an episode solely about bricks. But luckily for you, today is not that day. Instead, in this episode, we are going to jump right back into our quote-unquote Game of Thrones layer of history storytelling and pick up where we left off in episode 49, The Willing Bride. Maybe it's worth going back and listening to that episode again before this one, just to reacquaint yourself with some of the names and events. But mostly, you should listen to it again for evocative reminders of the desperate search for turtles that took place throughout various ponds in Spain and Italy, hunted to be cooked up and fed to Prince Juan to aid his fragile constitution. Of all the things we probably should recap, that's the only one we are going to. We've talked about a lot of tragedy in this podcast, but I'm still mostly sad about all those turtles who were turned into a medicinal soup and whose boiled demise only kept Juan alive for long enough that he could fornicate himself to death at the age of 19. Welcome to History of the Netherlands, where we explore the events and characters that over time have transformed a swamp into an amazing modern marvel. Episode 54, The Widowed Bride. After Prince Juan's death in 1497, Margaret of Austria spent almost 2 years in mourning in Spain, being treated with empathy and kindness by the Catholic monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand. Margaret's sudden singleness meant that whether she liked it or not, her father Maximilian was going to update her profile on the Tinder for European royalty and start swiping through every eligible prince or king throughout the continent to see how he could next use his daughter for his own political gains. We will sort through the prospective matches, and while Margaret travels through France on her way back home, we'll make a detour there ourselves for a game of royal tennis which will end in a royal death, divorce, and subsequent sex scandal. Salacious. Margaret of Austria arrived back in Ghent in March 1500, just in time to be present at the christening of her nephew, Charles, a grandiose celebration such as had not been seen in the Low Countries before, even including a fire-breathing dragon. In the aftermath, Margaret's future would once again be discussed within the various courts of Europe, and she would be married off for a third and final time, this time to a guy called Philibert the Handsome, the Duke of Savoy. After a year of mourning her husband Juan, Prince of Asturias, in Spain, Margaret of Austria had still not returned to her home country of Flanders. By all reports, she was treated with love and kindness by the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella as a grieving daughter, all of them bound together by their shared sorrow. After all, when Prince Juan had died, she was still pregnant and therefore carrying the heir to their thrones. When Ferdinand of Aragon ordered that news of Juan's death be taken to Margaret's father, the Emperor Maximilian, he said to, quote, "Tell him that our distress has prevented us from sending him the news earlier, and that our grief is increased by considerations for Princess Margaret, although she tries very hard, as befits her, to bear her trouble gently and wisely, and we try our best to console and please her, endeavouring to make her forget her loss. Her pregnancy, thanks be to God, goes on well, and we hope in His mercy that the result will be a reparation and consolation for our trouble. We do, and will, take as much care of the princess as we would of her husband if he were alive, and she will always fill the same place as he did in our hearts." End quote. Margaret gave birth to a stillborn daughter in April 1498, which on a human level must have heaped a near unbearable amount of grief onto the shoulders of an already much bereaved woman. Thoughts and discussions then turned towards her returning to her brother and or her father's lands. Yet she stayed in Spain still. We hear of Margaret teaching French to her deceased husband's younger sister, Catherine of Aragon, who was betrothed to the heir of England, Arthur, Prince of Wales, and whose name will become a very well-known one in the history of the coming Reformation. The Spanish ambassador to England, Gonzalo de la Puebla, wrote to Ferdinand and Isabella that, quote, "The Queen and the mother of the King wished that the Princess of Wales, Catherine of Aragon, should always speak French with the Princess Margaret, who is now in Spain, in order to learn the language and to be able to converse in it when she comes to England. This is necessary, because these ladies do not understand Latin, and much less Spanish. They also wish that the Princess of Wales should accustom herself to drink wine. The water of England is not drinkable, and even if it were, the climate would not allow the drinking of it." End quote. Undrinkable water and complaints about the weather in England 500 years ago? Some things never change. In addition to Margaret of Austria's usefulness as a teacher of French, we also assume that Ferdinand of Aragon saw a political advantage in keeping Margaret in Spain, even after she had lost her daughter. The succession to the powerful Castilian throne had then moved into the hands of Ferdinand and Isabella's eldest surviving daughter, also called Isabella, who was married to King Manuel I of Portugal. However, word began to filter into Spain that Maximilian's son, Philip the Fair, the husband of their next oldest daughter, Joanna, had started styling himself Prince of Castile. Cheeky little bugger. In August 1498, the daughter Isabella died after giving birth to a son and heir, who sadly also died before his second birthday. As such, the right to succession in Castile and Aragon went to Joanna, and then via the medieval concept of jura uxoris, by which a noble man held the right to rule his wife's lands as he wished, effectively to Philip. This greatly concerned Queen Isabella's husband, Ferdinand, King of Aragon. At the very least, the fact that Philip's sister Margaret was still in Spain gave him some leverage in this situation. On a cold political level, in the eyes of powerful monarchs who dominated the political scene of Western Europe during this time in Spain, England, France, the Low Countries, and the Holy Roman Empire, Margaret was once more a pawn to their interests. Over the coming months, there would be a lot of ambassadorial toing and froing in which Margaret's future would be much discussed. We don't want to go into all the details of this, but if you are interested in that minutiae, a good source is the Calendar of State Papers, Volume 1, 1485 to 1509. This is a collection of accounts related to the diplomatic relationship between England and the Spanish kingdoms, now held in an archive at the Spanish town of Simancas, but available online, translated at british-history.ac.uk. Simply speaking, there were now multiple paths towards remarriage that Margaret's future might take. Rumours flew that she was going to marry the King of France, or maybe English King Henry VII's son, Arthur, the Prince of Wales, who, again, was already engaged to Catherine of Aragon. Or perhaps she would be married to the King of Scots, or the King of Poland, the Duke of Milan, or even the King of Hungary. The theoretical idea of marrying Margaret of Austria, or suggesting that someone else should do so, would help lubricate the gears of trans-European diplomacy until her father or brother made a final decision. Maximilian set the tone of his official position regarding all of these prospects in correspondence with the Spanish ambassador, Fuensalida. Quote, "There is no prince in Christendom whom she could marry. The King of Naples has no son of marriageable age. The King of England has already betrothed his son to the daughter of the Catholic sovereigns. The King of Scotland is a poor thing. The Duke of York, i.e. Perkin Warbeck, that impostor we mentioned him a few episodes ago, is married and not at liberty. The King of Hungary has a wife already. The King of Poland is a nobody, so that there is no fit husband for her. It is true that the King of France is talking of repudiating his wife, being Anne of Brittany, and marrying her to Monsieur Louis with great dowries and states, whilst he keeps Brittany, since he had lost hope of having children by her, and he wants to marry my daughter Margaret." So just to recap and step in there, we are talking about the same King of France who had been betrothed to Margaret as a child, but then who had ditched her for Anne of Brittany. He was now thinking of going back on that all again. To continue with Maximilian's quote, "But I will not consent to this on any account, nor would my daughter, for she has a great objection to go to France. Besides, I know for a fact that the King of France caused something to be given to her to bring on her miscarriage, and tried to poison King Ferdinand as well, so that there is nothing to be said about my daughter's marriage yet a while." End quote. To give context to this official position, which was surely just gamesmanship from Maximilian, we know that he was in the process of making a peace with France, going behind the backs of Ferdinand and Isabella. Eleanor E. Tremaine, who wrote a seminal book on Margaret in the early 20th century, wrote of this that, quote, "We may be quite sure that this hint that a French alliance was possible for Margaret was intended to remind Ferdinand that he must be careful not to offend his ally." End quote. For their part, the Spanish ambassadors tried long and hard to just keep Margaret in Spain, arguing that the French king, Charles VIII, had less chance of getting his grubby little claws into her while she was on the Iberian Peninsula. Maximilian sent a group of diplomats to go and get her, and the Spanish convinced them how dangerous the sea voyage would be, to the point that they begged Maximilian for a bigger, more protected ship. The tides of history, however, would shift again in April 1498, giving Maximilian the chance to bring her home another way, and that way would be through France. It's worth digressing for a while to talk about France, if only because it's been a while, but also because a lot of the wider international politicking going on, of which Margaret's relationship status was a concern, was largely to do with how everybody felt about France. Fair warning, this digression is going to take us to some dark and unexpected places. At this stage in our story, the time had come for another transformational moment for the French kingdom, which would happen in the form of the person who wore its crown. The last time we really spoke about the King of France, Charles VIII, we saw him retreating out of Italy in the summer of 1495 after his campaigning there saw pretty much all of his major enemies, Spain, England, the Holy Roman Empire, and a bunch of Italian states, coalesce against him in the form of the Holy League. This anti-French alliance had been one of the major motivations behind the double marriages between Philip the Handsome and Princess Joanna and Margaret of Austria and Prince Juan, which had linked the Spanish and Habsburg dynasties. The tensions between France and the Holy League had made traveling between Spain and the Low Countries a dangerous affair. That was the reason why Margaret and Joanna had to endure horrendous sailing voyages to attend their respective weddings. Well, Charles VIII died in April 1498 in such strange circumstances that we will let the chronicler and an old mate of ours, Philip de Commines, relate the story in full. Quote, "On the 7th of April 1498, being the eve of Palm Sunday, Charles VIII took his queen, Anne of Brittany, by the hand and led her out of her chamber to a place where she had never been before, to see them play at tennis in the castle ditch. It was the nastiest place about the castle, broken down at the entrance, and everybody committed a nuisance in it that would. The king was not a tall man, yet he knocked his head as he went in. He spent some time in looking upon the players and talked freely with everybody. I was not there myself, for I had gone to my country house about a week before, but his confessor, the Bishop of Angers, and the gentlemen of his bedchamber, who were then about him, told me what I write. The last expression he used whilst he was in health was that he hoped never to commit a mortal sin again, nor a venial sin if he could help it. And with those words in his mouth, he fell down backwards and lost his speech. It was about 2 in the afternoon when he fell, and he lay motionless till 11 o'clock at night. Thrice he recovered his speech, but he quickly lost it again, as his confessor told me, who had confessed him twice that week, once, of course, and a second time upon occasion of his touching for the king's evil. Every one went into the gallery that pleased, where the king was laid upon a coarse bed, and he never left it till he died, which was 9 hours after. The confessor told me that every time he recovered his speech, he called out upon God, the glorious Virgin Mary, St. Claude, and St. Blaise to assist him. And thus died that great and powerful monarch in a sordid and filthy place, though he had so many magnificent palaces of his own, and was building another more stately than any of them, yet he died in this poor chamber. How plain then and natural is it, from these 2 examples, for us to acknowledge the power and omnipotence of God, and that our life is but a span and a trifle, though we are so greedy and ambitious after the riches of this world, and that princes, no more than peasants, are able to resist the Almighty." End quote. Well, that is one colourful story. A short man who dies after innocuously hitting his head on a doorframe while going to watch a tennis match. Charles VIII and Anne of Brittany had had their own struggles to produce heirs, with 4 children being born but not one surviving infancy. As such, and due to the fact that the French interpretation of Salic law meant that women could not inherit the crown, upon Charles's death, his cousin Louis, Duke of Orleans, became the new King of France. We spoke about Louis in episode 48, when we saw him retreating from the castle of Navarra after having been besieged there for months during the French retreat from Italy in 1495. When Charles VIII died, Anne of Brittany began making moves to reassert Brittany's independence from France. As mentioned, Margaret of Austria had spent her childhood betrothed to Charles VIII, being raised at the court in France to one day become its queen. Charles abruptly broke off their engagement, however, when he instead married Anne of Brittany, who, if you recall, had already actually been married by proxy to Margaret's father Maximilian, so was Margaret's mother-in-law. It's all very inbred. That marriage had brought the fiercely independent Duchy of Brittany into the hands of the French king, and had been the reason for Margaret of Austria's first long trek across France back to the Low Countries after a discarded betrothal. Soon after Charles died, Anne began making appointments within Brittany and had coins minted there which proclaimed Anne, by the grace of God, Queen and Duchess of the Britons. The new king, Louis XII, did not want to lose Brittany, and knew that within the terms of Anne's marriage contract to Charles VIII was a clause that said she would marry his successor. Perfect. The problem was that Louis himself was already married to Charles VIII's older sister, Joan of France. Sometimes known as Joan the Lame, she was the second child of King Louis XI, the Universal Spider. Joan had been born disabled, reportedly having a club foot and scoliosis, hence the lame part of her moniker. When she was around 9 years old, her father lived up to his Universal Spider nickname and organized for Joan to be married to Louis of Orleans, Orleans being a cadet branch of the ruling Valois house. He apparently figured Joan would not be able to have children and wanted to make sure that the Orleans branch of the family tree ended there. Louis XI got special dispensation from the Pope for Joan and Louis of Orleans to be married, despite the fact that they had shared consanguinity, which is to say that they were cousins. He also apparently made it clear that Louis of Orleans had no choice in the matter, apparently threatening him with drowning if he did not go through with it. The two were married in 1476, But now, 22 years after that, and in his new position as king, Louis XII wanted to ensure Brittany remained part of France, so he appealed to Pope Alexander VI for an annulment. The ensuing papal tribunal was a dead-set scandal at the time. At first, Louis XII argued that the marriage should be annulled because of the fact that they were too closely related, but Joan's lawyers simply pointed to the previous papal dispensation and said, yeah, but this covers that. So then Louis pivoted to say that he had actually been forced into the marriage by Louis XI, which, if he had actually been threatened with drowning, was probably a fair enough point. The problem with this line of argument, however, is spelled out by David Davray in his book Papacy, Monarch and Marriage. Quote, in the Middle Ages, no formal marriage ceremony was required for a valid marriage, so that mutual consent at any point during the time the couple had been together would arguably have made it into a marriage. It was not just a matter of showing that consent was lacking when the wedding took place. The length of time the marriage lasted was consequently difficult to justify legally, though the case was not absurd. End quote. They had been married for 22 years, so it doesn't seem difficult to imagine that Louis consented to the marriage at some point during that time. The strongest grounds Louis XII had for annulment was when he argued that the marriage had not been consummated. One way to test this would be for Joan to undergo a physical examination of her private parts, but she argued, rightfully so, that this would be inappropriate for a woman of her standing. She could have just said, inappropriate for any woman. Instead, both sides made solemn oaths, Joan claiming that they definitely had had sex, and Louis XII saying the opposite. The king's physician, Salomon de Bombelle, was called as a witness. He testified that he once remarked to the king that one of his bodyguards was complaining that Louis and Joan were having too much sex, to which Louis had responded, quote, the devil I do. I have never in my life mounted her naturally like another woman. Bombelle goes on, and when the speaker replied that the same lord, our king, ought to have a talk with her with a view to obtaining his freedom, he replied to this that he did not know, and when he wanted to have intercourse with her, he found a certain twistedness at the orifice of the vulva, such that his penis could not enter. But as he aroused himself, he ejaculated the semen between or over the legs of the same Lady Joan, and this act displeased him so much that he would have wished to have married one of the poorer noble women of this kingdom. End quote. That's a graphic description, but it does at least maybe explain how both sides solemnly testified the way they did. Joan might have thought that they had been having sex. Louis, on the other hand, didn't. The scandalous ordeal continued with allegations of witchcraft, which we don't need to get into, but in the end, Pope Alexander VI had the marriage annulled. Funnily enough, shortly thereafter, the French king had the Pope's son, César Borgia, declared to be the Duke of Valentinois, a completely made-up title, and also arranged a good marriage for him. So, yeah, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. In December 1498, the marriage was annulled, and on the 7th of January 1499, Louis XII was married to Anne of Brittany, keeping that important territory in union with France. As for Joan of France, she was made Duchess of Berry and moved off to Bourges. There she began building a monastery and founded a new religious order called Order of the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She died 6 years later, but that order still exists to this very day, and in 1950 she was made a saint by Pope Pius XII. In the midst of all these proceedings, Maximilian considered the death of Charles VIII as a chance to maybe have another stab at Brittany, to whose duchess, the recently widowed Anne of Brittany, he had once been married. When that evidently was not going to progress, he began to conjure up ideas of old Burgundian territories being brought back into his son's realm. Some of these, although providing the titular weight to his son's princedom, had been passed back into the House of Valois upon the death of Charles the Bold in 1477. Maximilian reckoned that they were Philip's by right, and he sent some troops into France and urged his son to get involved with him. The Archduke Philip, however, did the opposite, and concluded the Treaty of Paris with the new King Louis XII in August 1498, in which he renounced any claims on Burgundy or Brittany. Around the same time, the Spanish and English monarchs also came to a settlement with France. For Margaret of Austria, this meant she could now safely depart Spain and comfortably make her way back to Flanders over land across France. She left Spain in September 1499, never to return. At Bayonne, Margaret was met by an envoy from her brother, filled with people who were familiar to her, such as the woman who had been with her since birth, Madame de Cumain. Her entourage continued on through the winter months, and in late February, shortly before she reached Ghent, she received word that her sister-in-law, Joanna, had given birth to a son. She pushed on and reached the town on the 4th of March, in time for the infant's baptism. And with that, dear listeners, we too are going to depart for an ad break. On the other side, we'll explore the birth and baptism of Charles V, and also learn which name the eligible bachelor Wheel of Fortune will land on for Margaret of Austria and her future marriage prospects. Welkom terug. Welcome back. The child whose birth we alluded to before the break, Philip the Handsome and Joanna of Castile's second kid, but importantly, first son, will eventually grow up to become Emperor Charles V. He will reign over the biggest empire Europe had seen up until that point, during some of the most complex and transformative times Europeans have ever lived through. So, fair warning, it is safe to say that you are going to hear a lot about him over the next many episodes. For now, however, it is worth telling a little about his very first big moments in life, namely the circumstances of his birth and then 2 weeks later, the baptismal celebration that enveloped the people of Ghent as they got to see their new native prince. Charles was born in the Hof ten Walle in Ghent in the early hours of February 24th, 1500. His birth was seen as such a significant event that from that point on, the building would be known as the Prinzenhof, the Prince's Court. In his book, Emperor: A New Life of Charles V, historian Geoffrey Parker quotes a court poet who was in Ghent at the time and wrote of the occasion, quote, "Great and small shouted Austria and Burgundy throughout the whole city for 3 hours. Everyone ran about while shouting the good news of the birth of a Prince of Peace." End quote. In the original Dutch text of that quote, you get the word pas eiselijk, which perhaps instead of meaning a Prince of Peace, might actually mean an Easter Prince, given the time of year. Another old friend of ours, Molinet, who was chronicling this for the court at the time, mentions, quote, "All the people of the country, and especially the people of Ghent, were supremely rejoiced," end quote. Another primary source much used by historians for this period, a Spanish envoy in the Burgundian court called Diego Ramirez de Villa Escusa de Haro, whom we'll just call Villa Escusa, wrote in a letter to his monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, quote, "The people celebrated and did no work, and at night there was great celebration and much joy, and from all these festivities, the greatest beneficiaries were the tavern keepers," end quote. It would not take much for anybody who has been to Ghent in modern times to imagine what the consumption of copious amounts of Belgian beer might have looked like in the city during these ad hoc celebrations. A more colourful account of Charles's birth can be found in an 1838 French-language Belgian history called Histoire des Troubles des Pays-Bas by Luc Jean Joseph van der Vingt, which we have translated as follows, quote, "The Infanta, being Charles's mother Joanna, experienced at intervals wanderings of the mind. She loved her husband desperately, but from this conjugal love was soon born a jealousy so violent that one sometimes saw terrible effects. This dominating passion burst forth on every subject, and often without subject. There is a singular example at the birth of Prince Charles, later Charles V. The archdukes lodged at Ghent at the palace still called today the Prinzenhof. On February 25th, his era, 1500, There was a great celebration at the court. The princess, magnificently adorned, was present at the end of her pregnancy, but she left for a moment under the pretext of some need. Her ladies, seeing her delay in returning, looked for her, and she was found alone in full labour in a very dangerous place and in no way intended for this august birth. She was rescued in time and happily gave birth to this monarch. There was no need to hide the circumstance from the public because everything went well, and the universal and tumultuous joy caused by this birth did not allow any search in this regard. No author, as far as I know, has made known this anecdote, which rests in Ghent on a discreet and good tradition." End quote. So basically, there's a folk story from Ghent that Joanna, jealous and scared that her husband was going to flirt with other women at a ball, got all dressed up and attended the party, only to have to leave hastily to give birth in a room that was not really suited as a birthing room. Over time, this has morphed into another story told by Flemish author Louis Paul Boon in his final novel, Het Gozenboek, published in 1979. Quote, "It happened at 4 o'clock in the early morning of February in the year 1500, when the city of Ghent was still asleep. Joanna of Castile, the Spanish woman, who would soon be called the Mad Woman for hidden state interests, was in the last moments of her pregnancy. The wind howled in the narrow streets, the rain pelted against the small windows of the Prinsenhof. With her swollen belly, she let herself be put on the chamber pot for a moment, and sitting there, she gave birth to her second child, her son, who would be called Charles. It was ridiculous, grotesque, and horrible. From the garbage of a chamber pot, one had to pick up this one who would become the Emperor Charles, the last prince of the great Burgundian Empire, the ruler who would say with incomparable arrogance, 'In my country, the sun never sets.'" End quote. So, a local legend, immortalized in writing by an author centuries removed from the actual events, suggests that the person who would become the most powerful man in the world was born on a toilet. You can take that one with a grain of salt. Although the actual moment of Charles's birth is wrapped up in mystery and folktale, the spectacular occasion of his baptism is more well documented. The most well-known sources about the baptism are the Chronicles by Molinet and Prudencio de Sandoval, but a more vivid account is in a letter written to Ferdinand and Isabella by Villa Escusa, the Spanish envoy. An article which analyzes the source material for our knowledge about the baptism and which delves into its layers of meaning is titled The Baptism of Charles V, written by Rolf Strom Olsen, who is a professor of humanities at the IE University of Segovia in Spain. We've relied a lot on this article for this section. As mentioned before the break, Margaret of Austria and her entourage had been on the road back to the Low Countries from Spain for over 5 months when she received word that Joanna had given birth to Charles. So Margaret hurried on to Ghent and arrived a few days before the baptismal celebration. Preparations for it were already well underway. Villa Escusa wrote about Margaret arriving back in Ghent, saying, quote, "On arriving in Ghent, there were many torches, lanterns, and candles in the street," end quote. The baptism was held on March the 7th, 1500, and was an event that had no real precedent for its grandeur and public nature. Baptism of an heir had long been a big deal, of course, though not ever on such a grand scale. In the early days of the Valois Dukes of Burgundy, the baptisms in the family would involve a relatively humble procession to a grandly decorated church. In his article, Strom Olsen notes that only from the reign of Philip the Good were dignitaries from the different territories of the Burgundian dukes expected to attend the baptisms. Following the crisis caused by the death of Charles the Bold, and the subsequent wars and the rebellions that happened under the stewardship of the foreign prince Maximilian, the birth of Philip the Fair in 1478 had represented the arrival of a prince naturel, a native-born prince to the Low Countries. Molinet tells us of Philip's baptism in Bruges, and that, quote, "A gallery of wood was built, 8 feet wide and raised 2 cubits off the ground, which started from the residence of the Duke, passing along the Rue de Saint-Amand, through the market, and ending at the Church of Saint-Donat." End quote. Essentially, for Philip's baptism, in what was a first for the Low Countries, a long catwalk had been constructed for the whole court to make their way through town and do their little turns. You know what I mean? On the catwalk. This novelty serves several purposes. Besides physically elevating the ruling clan above the crowd, it actively invited the crowd in the first place, creating a space for them to stand in contrast to the catwalk. With Philip's baptism and the raised wooden walkway, there was a definite role for the public to play as spectators and participants in the event. The event could come to represent more than just the baptism of a new ruler, but a communal celebration of unity that transcended class lines. So by the time we get to the baptism of Philip's first child, Eleanor, yes, he had a daughter before Charles, born in 1498, not only do we find the elevated wooden walkway, but then also 18 gates constructed along it that represented the 18 titles due to the heir of the Burgundian holdings, and torches in the surrounding buildings lighting the way. Molinet writes of Eleanor's baptism and of children who participated in the ceremony, such as one, quote, luxuriously dressed, holding a staff in his hand in the manner of a prophet, end quote, and of other kids standing under the gates who, quote, dressed as angels and shepherds, sang melodiously, end quote. We can assume from this that a lot of the preparations for Eleanor's baptism came before it was known whether or not she was a son or a daughter, and therefore whether she would be the heir to the Habsburg lands. So her baptism ended up serving as a rehearsal for that of her younger brothers. When Charles was born then, a 2-week clock started ticking down for workers and organizers in Ghent to get things in order for the celebration of yet another Prince Naturel, who would keep their interests at heart when he eventually came to rule. His existence was political from the beginning. There was actually a controversy at court around his chosen name and given titles. He was named Charles after his godfather, the powerful Prince of Chimay, Charles de Croix, but clearly also as a nod to his great-grandfather, Charles the Bold. His title was supposed to be Count of Charolais, but this was seen as possibly antagonistic towards France, so he was given Duke of Luxembourg instead. Rolf Strom-Olsen argues that there were different layers of political maneuverings around this. Quote, "The dispute shows the tension that existed over the question of continuity with Valois traditions. It is probable that many in the Habsburg court saw it as advantageous to separate their dynastic fortunes from those associated with Charles the Bold as a way to send a message of appeasement to Ghent and the other cities of Flanders." End quote. If you remember back to episode 30, A Rebuke of the New Duke, the city of Ghent had given Charles the Bold an extremely rude welcoming when he made his joyous entry as Duke of Burgundy in 1467. The memory of Charles's violent rule and the collective punishments he meted out, as well as the financial and political turmoil that marked his reign and the time after his death, lingered long in the minds of the people of Flanders, and particularly the people of Ghent. But in the organization of this event, clearly some hurdles had been gotten over, because there was definitely collaboration between the civil authorities of Ghent and those in the court who had been tasked with overseeing it. We know this because Ghent forked up most of the cash for the whole ceremony. We also know how much cities like to try and outdo each other. Ghent had seen Brussels put on the baptism for Eleanor, and now was their chance to outdo them. And just as joyous entries had become a conventional occurrence for which cities were supposed to draw pride, with this now the baptism of ducal children was coming to serve the same purpose. Even for a people accustomed to hosting lavish, joyous entries, apparently the Gentenaars outdid even themselves. In the words of Molinet, they, quote, put themselves to work so magnificently that nothing was spared, end quote. The procession route was adorned with 40 triumphal arches, 3 of which were larger than the rest and had written on them the words wisdom, justice, and peace. The other gates represented the various titles that Charles would inherit. There were also tableaux vivants, living scenes with actors portraying classical and biblical allegories, all revolving around the themes of water and baptism. Villa Escusa, again describing the event for his king and queen, wrote, quote, after the final gate of the palace, a walkway led into the city, and after some 30 pesos, a pesos is a unit of measurement, about 2 foot or 60 centimeters, began a building constructed of wood in the form of a bridge, rising above the ground on wooden beams and supported in some places half a story above the ground, and in some places more and others less. And this was constructed in the street so that on both sides there remained a certain space between the bridge and the houses, in certain places wider and others less wide, in which space the inhabitants watched the solemn procession, for in the actual bridge were only those who were going to accompany the prince to celebrate the baptism. And this bridge extended to the church of St. John, which is in the middle of the city and where the baptism was to be held. End quote. The event was done at night, so the visual motifs and the representations had to be expertly illuminated. Across the city, flame and light was used in various ways to enhance the entire spectacle, with thousands of torches and candles used to light the procession. Flames even shot out of the mouth of a 14th century metal dragon, which stands atop one of Ghent's famous medieval structures, the Belfort. On the River Lye, the Shippers Guild, with whom we should feel some acquaintance following our episode 53, had a bedecked boat lit up by 225 flambeaux. And now we invite you, dear listener, to please ritualistically light up 225 flambeaux in your mind, because we are about to illuminate your brain with your favorite segment of this podcast. Ding, ding, ding. Bet you didn't know that was Dutch. And no, we're not talking about the word flambeau, meaning torch, because clearly that's French, and the Dutch word for it anyway is a fakkel, which coincidentally is also an Australian description of how much relevance this segment often has to the topic of each episode. Fakkel. No, the word we are excited about is bedecked, which you don't hear that often in English, but which comes from the Middle Dutch word dekken, meaning to cover. You hear bedecked's root verb, to deck, in the Christmas Carol, deck the halls. Bedecked, you didn't know that was Dutch. Fa la 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 la. Going back to our bedecked boat in Ghent, Villa Escusa says that, quote, for this event, it had been done up so that its bow, stern, mast, and topsail were all covered in tapestries down to the water, end quote. A band standing on its deck pumped out tunes all night from within the ship as people watched on in wonderment and joy. To top it all off, the next day a jousting ceremony was held in which even Philip the Handsome took part. We could go on about this in loads more detail, but we've already established the most important part. If you are getting the sense that this was a huge party for everybody in the city, then you are thinking the right way. However, what we really want to emphasize here is that this wasn't just like every other big public celebration, many of which we've seen in previous episodes. The joyous entries we have spoken about in the past were all political and constitutional affairs, where the people were greeting their prince and the prince would uphold and confirm their privileges and make various appointments. Joyous entries were a necessary part of the constitutional agreements that had developed between the Burgundian dukes and the different people of their diverse territories. But as Strom Olsen writes, quote, Charles's baptism marks a moment where a ritual event moves from reinforcing the contractual and legal obligations that bond a ruler with his subjects to operating on a broader political level through a symbolism and convention that was intended to transcend regional political identities and to offer a rhetorical narrative designed to portray the Habsburg dynasty as more than simply the sum of its parts. End quote. Arguably, this was the culmination of a process that had started with Philip the Good, who had done so much to garner so many different titles of the Low Countries into his family's hands, and was the first to insist that foreign dignitaries attend his children's baptisms, even though there was no legal obligation for them to do so. Now, some generations later, the baptism of a new native prince was enough to get representatives from all across the Low Countries to descend upon the most rebellious city in the Low Countries, where everyone could attend an event that cost a lot of hard work, literally elevated their lords above them all, and which they had to pay for themselves. Whilst the long-time wish of the Burgundians to become kings had not quite come to fruition, here was an event that suggested the ruler's embodiment as the state, like Strom Olsen said, greater than the sum of its parts. This was as close to a coronation as the Low Countries could get. To wrap this episode up, it behooves us to take a brief look at what happened to Margaret of Austria in the aftermath of Charles's baptism. As one of Charles's 4 godparents, Margaret had played a central role in the whole baptismal ceremony, as described by Villa Escusa. After the procession had brought the group into the church, quote, bishops and abbots and the princess, being Margaret, and Madame la Grande, being Margaret of York, still with us, climbed up to the first platform and presented the child for unwrapping, and having been unwrapped, was taken and carried to the highest stage, onto which climbed the princess and Madame la Grande, the godmothers, the Prince of Chimay and the Seigneur de Berg, the godfathers, and the said bishops. End quote. Now that the big event was over, however, what remained regarding Margaret was still the big question that had haunted her life ever since infancy. Who should she be married off to? Well, while her brother and father figured that out for her, she was to be sent off to the palace at La Quesnoy in Hanau, which you might remember was the personal estate where Charles the Bold had spent so much time, especially during the years he had been estranged from his father. As mentioned at the start of this episode, Margaret's marriage prospects were of interest to multiple people who sat in the top echelons of European power. France and Spain were still contesting over Naples and Italy. The Burgundian court in Brussels saw pro-Spanish and pro-French parties contesting for power, with the Francophilic Croy family once again coming into dominance. It wasn't long before Philip had betrothed his new heir, Charles, to marry a French princess. The Spanish King of Aragon, Ferdinand, who had worked so hard politically to keep France isolated, had arranged for his youngest daughter, Catherine, to marry Arthur, the Prince of Wales, the heir to the English throne. So for Margaret's brother Philip, being pro-France, the idea of disrupting this union by marrying Margaret off to the English instead was certainly on the table. Supposedly, the idea was to bring about a Franco-English Burgundian alliance against the Spanish. Amidst all of this, Maximilian's position remained kind of obscure. His focus had turned more and more towards launching a crusade, yes, that old chestnut, and although he had been ostensibly allied with Ferdinand and Isabella through their children's marriages, Ferdinand rightly suspected that he was negotiating with the French behind their backs. Amongst all that, though, Maximilian continued to ponder the multitude of marriage proposals received for his daughter's hand, which we went through earlier in this episode. When the Spanish ambassador Fuensalida visited Margaret in 1500, he learned of a marriage proposal that had come from the Duke of Savoy, ruler of the lands nestled between France, Italy, and Switzerland. According to Fuensalida, both Margaret and Maximilian were favourable to the match. It has been argued that Philip was against the match, since it would mean Margaret would no longer be a piece that could be used against Spain, but also because by marrying into Savoy, Margaret would officially take dominion over some southern Burgundian lands which their mother had bequeathed to her, but which Philip had controlled on her behalf. Margaret's marriage to Savoy would see Philip lose land. His contention to it, however, is disputed elsewhere, since the marriage to Savoy could be seen as a win-win for Philip and for Max. Savoy's closeness to France, Philibert was a cousin of the recently deceased King Charles VIII, would appease the Francophilic Philip. Try saying that 10 times. But it would also please Maximilian because now he would have a land passage to get to Italy. And if he got to Italy, he could finally go and be crowned emperor by the Pope. Perhaps the biggest obstacle to the marriage was Margaret herself. In her biography of Margaret, Jane de Jong tells us that, quote, when Philip the Handsome presented her with a document to sign in which she was to declare that no form of pressure had been used upon her, Margaret refused to set her name to it. By this action, she showed herself to be no longer the totally will-less pawn of whom ambition and arrogance could dispose at pleasure. But she still lacked the courage to oppose this new marriage, which Philip, for his own selfish political reasons, forced upon her. End quote. In August of 1501, she was shipped off to her third husband, called Philibert the Handsome, Duke of Savoy. Yep, that's right. Her new fella had a similar name and the exact same epithet as her brother. To Phil the Handsomes, just what we need for a little bit of clarity on this whole situation. We started off this episode with Margaret of Austria as a new widow after the sudden death of her husband, and we've ended it up with her marrying a new prince. He might even turn into a Prince Charming. She got along well with her new husband Philibert, and he was a man with many interests, but government administration was not one of them. So his bastard brother René had taken the lead there, being in control when Margaret arrived. Margaret, though, had obviously undergone some serious growth from being the young princess whose destiny was decided by others to a duchess whose destiny might have been chosen by others, but which she was going to grab with both hands. She lived up to her high intelligence and would prove herself to be a shrewd political operator, soon coming to be the active ruler of Savoy. There she would have some of the happiest years of her life, whilst further developing her skills in government, leadership, and people management. Even though she had been shuttled around from one arranged marriage to another, within the space of one episode no less, from this point on, Margaret was not going to be a mere pawn anymore. But she also wasn't just going to live happily ever after as some French duke's missus. There's still a lot of evolution to happen in the future for Margaret of Austria, and we will see what shape her final form takes in future episodes of History of the Netherlands. Thank you so much for listening to History of the Netherlands. If you've been looking for us on social media, well, there is one place we are now, which is Blue Sky. You can find us there at historyofnl.bsky.social. That's right, we've gone to a liberal safe space, primarily to get away from the dumpster fire Nazi-saluting hellhole of X. As always, we greatly appreciate and value your patience and continued support of our work. It takes a lot of time to read and research for each episode, not to mention write, record, and edit it all. And there's only two of us who make this show. We simply couldn't do it without the generous support and contributions of listeners on patreon.com/history of the Netherlands. We welcome contributions of all sizes. If any of you out there are secretly billionaires, KLM pilots, or lingering European aristocracy, don't forget that we will happily accept your patronage too. Except Elon Musk. You're not welcome. In truth, we will always be for the people because the people are there for us. And this week, the people are George. I'm not sure if you're active in Australian rules football fan podcasting circles, but we are. So we're going to pretend that you are and therefore nickname you From the Outer. Thanks kindly for your training reports. From us, John Ricketson. First of all, salutations to your father Ricket. Secondly, we hope your lineage has recovered from the lingering effects of 18th century English industrial pollution and subsequent lack of vitamin D for children. Did you know that in Dutch, rickets is known as Engelse ziekte, or the English disease? For that reason, you get the nickname Johnny Softbones. Cheers, Bonesy. Next up is Jackie Pearson. Thanks a lot, Jackie. In a similar vein to the previous supporter, we would like to say g'day to your dad. Pear. Much like in English we say comparing apples and oranges, in Dutch they say comparing apples and pears. So for that reason, you're called Orange, and you're now a member of the Dutch royal family. Congratulations. You didn't even need an arranged marriage. Then there's Geoffrey Egger, clearly known as Onya, as in egg on your face. Thanks, matey. Much appreciated. In other words, good on ya, Onya. And finally, Joe Crease. With your contribution, you have unfolded our love and warmed us up with your iron of generosity. Thanks for not hanging us out to dry, Launders. And that's it for today. Until next time, tot de volgende keer. Doei. Thanks for listening to History of the Netherlands. You can get detailed show notes at our website, historyofthenetherlands.com. From there, you'll be able to find other podcasts and projects that we've created. This is a production of Republic of Amsterdam Radio.